Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war, where we have a lot of developments to cover throughout the front line. We start out in the northern direction, where here to the northwest of Robotina we have this development here, where we have this geolocated footage which shows Russian soldiers fighting in the forest lines in this direction, where they managed to capture this forest line and were under fire by Ukrainian FPV drones while doing these offensive operations. So we're seeing that there are some attempts by Russians in this direction to push the Ukrainian lines and cover the distance between their positions and the Ukrainian defensive positions and gain more territory, which they have succeeded at. But there is some losses based on the footage which shows FPV drones hitting Russian positions in this captured forest line. We then move on to the direction of the southeast of K-shifka, where Russian tank was spotted in this direction, and again they were hit by Ukrainian artillery, but also shows further Russian operations in the direction between Luhansk and Kharkiv border here in the northern part of the eastern front of the Russo-Ukrainian war. We see continuous attempts by the Russians in this direction to further improve their positions, capture more territory, and try to take advantage of any Ukrainian weakness being shown in this direction, and the Ukrainians are hitting them heavily with artillery and FPV drones, trying to inflict as many casualties as possible during the Russian offensive operations. As for the turning direction, we see a return of fire by the Russians against Ukrainian positions here by the Serebets river line in the turning direction, where we see constant Russian attempts at hitting Ukrainian positions beyond the front line and try to cut off and destroy the Ukrainian armored vehicles here beyond the front line. The southeast of Minefields being down here and the turning direction being here by the crossing here between the west of the Turney area and the Serebets river. We then move down in the direction of Vil-a, where the Russians have fought and managed to advance both to the northeast of the village as well as to the south of the village, attacking it from two directions, assaulting the village in a pincer maneuver. We're seeing attempts by the Russians here to attack Vil-a from both the north and the south after recent advantage here in the eastern side, where the Russians have advanced by the railways, getting an advantage which has now allowed them to push in the direction of Vil-a from the northern direction, and at the same time with the recent advances here in the south and in the direction of Rostolivka, preventing further advances and supplies and reinforcements coming from Rostolivka to Vil-a. The Russians are now pushing from the southern directions to gain control over the areas and push further in the direction of the village, cutting it off from supplies and hitting it from both directions at the same time to improve their chances at capturing the village. We then move a bit to the southwest into the direction of Bohdanivka, where we have multiple geolocated footages. First, in the northwestern direction of the village, Russian soldiers in the forest lines here to the northwest of Bohdanivka were hit by Ukrainian FPV drones and artillery as we're trying to improve their positions here to the west of Bohdanivka. And as such, we also see that the gray zone here within the village of Bohdanivka has expanded in both directions, where the Ukrainians were pushed slightly back, but the Russian positions are very weak, so they could fall at any point here in the center of the village due to the heavy artillery of the Ukrainian forces here in the direction of the Russian positions. And the Russians are also responding, but with a more spread out response, where they're also hitting the back side of Bohdanivka, as is shown in this geolocated footage here, where we see Ukrainian positions here in the back being hit by Russian artillery. We then move further in the direction of K-shifka. We're here to the northwest of K-shifka in the forest lines, north of the fortifications. The Russian forces launched artillery strikes and FPV drones on Ukrainian positions here within the forest lines. The forest lines here to the north, as I mentioned in the previous analysis, is a very important point if the Russians want to cut off the Ukrainians here to the south of K-shifka. They need to capture this forest line here, and the ones to the west of K-shifka before they'll be able to advance further westwards. Any advances or attempts at advancing here to the west would be very detrimental and difficult without the capture of this forest line, and we're now seeing the heavy artillery strikes and FPV drone strikes on Ukrainian positions within it, which shows that the Russians definitely have an interest in capturing it and are attempting to do so with these preparations. We then move on in a southern direction towards the north of Kurdyomivka and Zelenopilia, where the Russians managed to advance a bit and capture the forest lines here to the north of the villages, which shows that there are continuous participation of Russian soldiers in this direction, where they attempt to push the Ukrainian forces back, push them beyond their positions, which are at the very edge of the frontline positions of the Ukrainians, which are likely the weakest right now, since the Russians are also hitting the northern flank, which will force the Ukrainians to relocate forces from these southern parts to the northern part. And as such, we're seeing these advances by the railways and now here to the north of K-shifka, although they are very small. A reason why these advances are very slow and very small could be that the weather is terrible throughout the whole front line. Taking a look in the Avdiivka direction, it is currently 2 degrees Celsius here at 1 a.m. and the Donetsk direction, in the Bakhmut direction, we see that it is -2 degrees, which is the few negative degrees we're having right now. Before tomorrow there'll be rain and positive degrees, Saturday positive degrees, but then Sunday night a snowstorm comes to Ukraine, which shows the temperature going down to -7 on Sunday, all the way to -21 on Tuesday, where snow continues all the way from Sunday to Wednesday. And even on Thursday, when the sun comes out, it'll be -11 to -13 degrees Celsius. So with this, we see terrible weather coming to Ukraine, complete with snow and very, very negative degrees Celsius. If you look at Fahrenheit, it'll become -5 degrees Fahrenheit on Tuesday, with less than 32 all throughout the Sunday night and all through Thursday. So with these drastic weather changes here in the Bakhmut direction as well as in the Avdiivka direction, we'll see that the ground will most likely freeze at some point during this time, and with the snow covering the ground, it will become very difficult to locate these positions, these dugouts that have been created throughout the front line. But most importantly, we'll see more armored advances in the frozen ground, so we may see more movement throughout the front line. But something very important to mention is also the minefields all throughout the front line, but more on that later. We move further south to take a look in the direction of Pervomaisk, where the Russians launch attacks here by the northern parts, which shows that the located areas here are indeed controlled by the Russians. They launched attacks in the northern parts of Pervomaisk, entering the village from the north, where they were hit by Ukrainian FPV drones. But with this, we see that there may be an attempt by the Russians to gain control over this whole area by flanking the Ukrainian positions and likely launching an attack from 3 different directions, from the southeast, southwest, and the northern direction. So we're seeing some infantry of the Russians in the northern parts trying to infiltrate the Ukrainian positions and take control of them before launching further attacks from the south. Especially with the worsening weather, we may see more offensive operations all throughout the front line in the coming days. We then move on to the Minefields direction, where we have this geolocated footage. It is fairly old, but this is where the discussion of the minefield comes in, and that is that the Russian assaults are also being halted by the minefields, similar to how the Ukrainian assaults were halted by the minefields during their summer offensive. And this just comes back to show that neither side really has a solution for these minefields, and since neither side really have a solution for them, both sides abuse it to the max, where they just add kilometers upon kilometers of minefields. This whole northern flank of Minefields is completely filled with mines, which is why we're seeing essentially no advances by the Russians. There have been some, but they've been very slow here in the northern direction. Compared to that, the southern direction was much faster, but this is likely because of how they were mainly using infantry-based assaults, and the eastern parts were already fairly close to Minefields, so they didn't have much to pass. It's not like their infantry mine-clearing vehicles are completely useless, but they are not capable enough to launch these large-scale armored assaults, and therefore we're seeing issues by both sides when it comes to launching these armored assaults, because it's very difficult to pass through these armored minefields, and under constant artillery fire, it is very difficult to just pass through, and based on that, we see many losses whenever a armored assault is launched, wherever or whoever is launching it. Finally, we move on to the Zaporizhia direction, where the Russians launched a tank to assault the Robotina direction here to the northwest of Robotina in these trench areas. And this tank was hit by an FPV drone of the Ukrainian forces, which ended up disabling the tank, and as a result of that, we saw no further advances by the Russians here to the west of Robotina. But we do see that there are some small assault groups, including armored vehicles, tanks, and so on, trying to improve the Russian positions to the west of Robotina. But again, this isn't a large force, and this is likely due to the heavy minefields, which prevents Russian advances in a large scale in these directions. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.